They found her kneeling in the mud at the edge of the Thornvale border, 300 wolves circling the clearing like teeth closing around a wound, and Alara Voss was singing. Not screaming. Not begging. Singing. A lullaby so quiet it barely carried past the first row of torches, her voice thin as smoke, her hands red to the wrists, with blood that was not her own. The massive silver wolf lay across her lap, its breathing shallow, its flank opened by 3 parallel gashes that exposed the white flash of rib beneath the meat. She did not know what she held. She did not know that every wolf in that circle had dropped to the ground, not from reverence for the ceremony, but from the sheer gravitational weight of the man bleeding in her arms. Alpha Daemon of the Thornvale pack stood at the front of the circle, his ceremonial torch guttering in the wind, his face a landscape of disbelief and dawning terror, because the wolf in the wolfless girl's lap was not a wolf at all. It was Lycan King Kylan Ardas, ruler of every territory from the Ashfall Mountains to the Southern Sea, and his gold eyes had just opened, fixed on Alara's face, with an expression that made Daemon's knees turn to river water. The king's broken mouth moved. One word, mine. The iron pendant was cold against Alara's chest. The way was always cold, a circle of hammered metal on a leather cord that her mother had pressed into her hands 11 years ago in a room that smelled of lavender and slow death. But that was later. That was how the story ended, or nearly ended. And to understand how a wolfless girl came to cradle a dying king in a clearing full of wolves who wanted her dead, you need to go back. Back to the smell of wet wool and wood ash. Back to the kennels. Alara Voss was the Thornvale pack's mender of books, not a healer. Healers required wolves, required the heightened senses and the regenerative touch that came with the shift. Alara had no wolf. She had been declared hollow at 16, same as every other wolfless member of the pack, fitted with the iron band they wore at the throat and assigned to whatever work required neither strength nor status. Most hollow wolves scrubbed floors or tended livestock. Alara had been given the archive because no one else wanted it. 3 rooms in the basement of the pack house, below the waterline, where moisture crept through the stone walls and turned centuries of pack records into pulp if left unattended. She spent her days with a bone folder and wheat paste, repairing genealogies, rebinding territorial treaties, pressing warped pages flat beneath weights made from river rocks. Her fingers were perpetually stained with iron gall ink. Her lungs carried the taste of mildew. She spoke to no one for hours at a stretch except the books themselves, murmuring apologies as she peeled apart pages fused by damp. The work suited her. Books did not flinch when they saw the collar. Thornvale was not the worst pack for a hollow wolf. That distinction belonged to Ashford or Greymore, where the wolfless were auctioned as labor to neighboring territories. In Thornvale, Alpha Daemon Cade simply pretended they did not exist. His gift was not cruelty but erasure. Hollow wolves ate in a separate room. They entered through the service corridor. They did not attend moon ceremonies, bonding rites, or the seasonal hunts that defined pack life. They were ghosts with iron at their throats, moving through a world of the living without leaving footprints. Daemon had not always been this way. Alara remembered a moment years ago when she'd been 17 and newly collared. She had been carrying a stack of damaged ledgers across the courtyard during a rainstorm, and Daemon had been crossing in the opposite direction with his beta. Their eyes had met. His gaze dropped to her collar, and something had moved across his face. Not pity exactly, something more like recognition. As if he understood, for one flickering instant, the specific weight of being told you were less. He'd opened his mouth. Then his beta had touched his elbow, and Daemon had looked away and kept walking, and the moment had closed like water over a dropped stone. He never looked at her again. That was worse, somehow, than if he'd spat. Alara slept in a narrow room behind the archive, on a cot with a mattress that smelled of mouse nests and old paper. The ceiling leaked when it rained. She kept a tin bucket beneath the worst spot and fell asleep to the plinking of water hitting metal, a metronome that measured out her nights in small, cold increments. She had one possession of value. The pendant. Her mother, Sarah Voss, had been a healer in a pack. Alara could not remember. The sickness had taken her when Alara was 5. The last clear memory was her mother's hands, dry and paper-thin with fever, closing Alara's fingers around the iron circle on its cord. "Feel it," her mother had whispered. "Feel how it hums when you hold it tight. That is not iron, little one, that is a heartbeat, and it will keep beating long after mine stops." Alara had not understood. She was 5. She understood now that the pendant was old, older than any artifact in the Thornvale archive, and that it did hum when she held it, a vibration so faint it might have been her own pulse. She wore it beneath her collar, iron against iron, and told no one. She was 23 now. She had been hollow for 7 years, and she had come to understand that the world would not change its mind about her, so she would simply outlast it. She would mend her books. She would eat her half portions. She would press her pendant to her chest in the dark and listen to its hum, and pretend it was her mother's voice saying, "You are not what they say you are." On the night everything changed, Alara was in the archive repairing a water-damaged territorial map when she heard the howl. It came from the eastern forest beyond the pack boundary. Not a hunting call, not a territorial warning. A sound of pain so raw and animal that it cut through 3 feet of stone and stopped Alara's hands mid-stitch. She sat still, needle in the air, listening. The howl came again. Shorter, weaker, a wolf in agony. Alara set down the map. She should not go. The eastern forest was beyond the border. Our wolves did not leave the compound after dark. She would be punished. She would lose her archive privileges. She would be reassigned to the livestock pens, where the work was brutal and the smell never washed out. She went anyway. The rain had started by the time she reached the tree line, a cold, fine rain that turned the trail to grease beneath her bare feet. She carried no torch. The pendant hummed against her chest, warmer than it should have been, almost guiding her forward through the dark with its strange, insistent pulse. She found him in a ravine. The wolf was enormous, easily twice the size of any shifted wolf she'd seen in Thornvale, with fur the color of storm clouds shot through with veins of silver. He lay on his side in a shallow creek bed, the water running pink around him. 3 deep gashes scored his left flank, and his breathing came in short, wet hitches that told Alara at least one rib was cracked. His eyes were closed. She could see his pulse in his throat, rapid and thread-thin. Alara knelt in the creek. The cold water soaked through her skirt instantly. She could smell copper and pine sap and something else, something that rose from the wolf's fur like heat from sun-warmed stone. It made her dizzy. It made her want to press her face against his neck and breathe until the world dissolved. She shook herself. The wolf was dying. That was what mattered. She had no healing gift, no supplies, no wolf to lend her strength. What she had was a voice and a pair of steady hands. She pressed her palms to the wolf's flank, feeling the shudder of his breathing, the sticky warmth of the blood, the way the muscle tensed and released beneath her touch, as if even unconscious he was fighting. "Shh," she said. "Shh, shh. I have you. You are not alone." She tore strips from the hem of her shift. She packed the wounds with moss from the creek bank, a technique she'd read about in a veterinary text she had repaired 3 years ago. The wolf's eyes fluttered. Gold. Pure gold. Bright as coins. Bright as the first light of morning on still water. He looked at her. Alara's breath caught. Something inside her chest cracked open. Not broke. Cracked like a seed splitting its casing. The pendant flared hot against her skin. She gasped, hand flying to her throat, and the wolf's gold eyes tracked the movement with a focus that had nothing to do with injury. "You are going to be fine," Alara told him, though she had no evidence for this. She cupped his massive head in both hands, his skull wider than her rib cage, his fur coarse and warm and still damp with creek water. "I am going to stay right here. And I am going to sing because that is the only medicine I have, and it will have to be enough." She sang. The lullaby her mother had sung in that lavender-scented room 11 years ago. She did not remember all the words. Some of them she invented, filling the gaps the way she filled the gaps in damaged manuscripts, with careful approximation and faith that the meaning would survive. Her voice was small and imperfect. It cracked on the high notes, but the wolf's breathing slowed. His eyes stayed open, gold and unblinking, fixed on her face. Independent, hummed in harmony with her voice, a low vibration that Alara felt in her sternum, in her teeth, in the marrow of her bones. She sang for an hour. The rain came down. The creek rose around her knees. The wolf's wounds impossibly began to close. Not fast, not magically, but the bleeding stopped. The torn edges of skin drew together like curtains being pulled shut by an invisible hand. Alara watched it happen and told herself it was the moss, the cold water, the natural regeneration of a shifted wolf. She did not let herself think about the pendant burning like a coal against her chest. Near dawn, the wolf's eyes closed. His breathing deepened. He was asleep, truly asleep, and Alara sat in the creek with her ruined shift and her numb legs and her raw singing sore throat and rested her forehead against his shoulder and slept too. She woke to voices, not one or two. Dozens. The ravine was full of wolves in human form, armed, wearing the black and silver that Alara did not recognize but that made her stomach drop with instinctive awareness. These were not Thornvale wolves. These wolves moved like blades, like coiled springs, like creatures for whom violence was not a last resort, but a first language. The silver wolf was gone. In his place lay a man. He was sprawled on the creek bank where the wolf had been, wrapped in a cloak someone had placed over him, and he was the most striking person Alara had ever seen. Dark hair cropped close to a skull built for severity, a jaw that could cut glass, a body that even injured, even unconscious, radiated the kind of authority that did not ask for obedience, but simply assumed it. His eyes opened, gold. Alara's pendant hummed so hard the cord vibrated against her neck. "Step away from the king," a voice said. Cooled, female. The woman who spoke was tall, lean, with close-cropped red hair, and a scar that ran from her left ear to the corner of her mouth. She had a sword drawn and its point was aimed at Alara's throat. The king. The word landed like a stone in still water. Alara looked from the woman to the man on the ground. His gold eyes were on her, only on her. The same focus the wolf had held, the same intensity that made the rest of the world blur at the edges. "Stand down, Marin," the man said. His voice was rough with pain, but it carried the effortless weight of someone who had never in his life had to repeat himself. "She is the reason I am breathing." The woman called Marin did not lower her sword. "Your Majesty, she is wearing a hollow collar. She is wolfless. I know what she is." He sat up. The effort cost him. Alara saw pain move through his face like weather, there and gone. He looked at her collar, and something terrible passed through his gold eyes. Rage, not at her, at the metal. "What is your name?" he asked. "Alara. Alara Voss." "Alara." He said it the way you say a word in a language you've been waiting your whole life to speak. "Who put this collar on you?" It was not a question. It was an inventory. "My pack," she said. "Thornvale. It is the custom for hollow wolves." Custom, he repeated, and the word sounded different in his mouth. Smaller. Meaner. He stood. Marin moved forward to help him. He waved her off. He stood there in the gray morning light, blood still crusted on his side where the wounds had closed to angry red lines, and he was taller than any man Alara had seen. His shadow fell over her like a wing. "I'm Kyle Ardis," he said, "and you are my mate." Alara said nothing. The pendant burned. The creek murmured. 30 soldiers stood in silence. A jay screamed in the canopy, oblivious and free. "No," she said. Kalen's eyebrows rose. It was the first time in possibly his entire life that a single syllable had caught him off guard. "No," Alara said again. She was shaking. Her shift was in tatters. Her feet were blue with cold and creek water dripped from her hair, and she was standing before the lichen king looking like something pulled from a drain, and she said, "I do not know what a mate bond is supposed to feel like. I have no wolf. I have nothing. And I have been told what I am by men with power so many times that I cannot take your word for it simply because you say it while standing." Marin's hand tightened on her sword. Kuhn stared at Alara for a long moment. Then something happened that made every soldier in the ravine shift uncomfortably. The Lycan king smiled, not a political smile, not a predator's baring of teeth. A real smile, small, surprised, slightly off-center, in a way that made his severe face briefly, strangely beautiful. Then I will not stand, he said. He knelt, in the Crete mud, in front of his soldiers, his captain, the forest, and the gray, indifferent sky. The Lycan king knelt before a wolfless girl in a ruined shift, and said, I am asking, not telling, I am asking you to let me prove it. Alara looked at him, his gold eyes, the mud on his knees, the wounds she had packed with moss and faith. The pendant hummed against her chest so hard she thought it might crack. Prove it, she said, and we will see. The journey to Ironholt took 3 days. Kaelin's company traveled on foot to the mountain passes because their king refused a litter, and his wounds, though closed, were not yet healed enough for a sustained shift. Alara walked beside Marna, who did not speak to her but who also did not let her fall behind, adjusting her pace with the unconscious precision of a woman accustomed to protecting people whether she liked them or not. Alara learned the shape of Kaelin's world through fragments. The soldiers spoke among themselves in low voices, and she gathered pieces like a woman mending a torn page. King Kaelin had been ambushed in the eastern forest. 3 rogue wolves, mercenaries hired by a rival faction in the western territories. The attack was political. It was supposed to look like an accident. The king had been separated from his guard and driven into the ravine where the rogues had opened his flank and left him to bleed. He should have died. A Lycan's regeneration was powerful, but the wounds had been treated with a conatum, a wolfsbane derivative that slowed healing to nearly human speed. Without intervention, without someone to stop the bleeding and hold him through the worst hours of the night, the king of all territories would have bled out in a creek bed and been found by morning as a corpse. Alara had intervened. Alara, who had no wolf, no healing gift, no training. Just moss and a lullaby, and a pendant that hummed. Marn told her this on the second night, standing at the edge of camp while Alara ate her first full meal in months, venison stew with actual chunks of meat and bread that was soft and warm instead of stale. He is not a gentleman, Maren said, staring at the fire. She was a warrior. She spoke with the economy of someone who measured words by their usefulness. He has killed. He has ordered deaths. He rules because he is the strongest thing alive, and he has never apologized for that. Alara waited. But he has been alone, Maren said. And lonely is a different animal than alone. Lonely makes even kings do desperate things. She looked at Alara. Do not be the desperate thing. Be the real thing or walk away. Alara said, I have never been anyone's desperate thing. I have never been anyone's thing at all. Maren studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded once sharply, the way a general acknowledges a soldier who has said something worth remembering. Ironholt was a fortress carved into the shoulder of a mountain, its walls the color of dried blood, its towers visible for 20 miles in every direction. It did not invite, it declared. This place exists. Adjust accordingly. Alara stood at the base of its gates and felt herself shrink. The pendant hummed. She pressed her hand to it and thought of her mother's voice. That is not iron, little one. That is a heartbeat. She walked in. The days that followed were a blur of overwhelming sensation. Chambers with ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow. Corridors that smelled of beeswax and old stone. Servants who looked at her collar and looked away quickly, not with the practiced erasure of Thornvale, but with something more like confusion. As if they could not reconcile what they saw with what their king had told them. Kaelin gave her space. He was nearby always, his presence a low hum at the edge of her awareness that she understood was the bond, but could not bring herself to trust. He did not touch her without asking. He did not enter her chambers unannounced. He sent her books, real books, not water-damaged relics, but bound volumes with gilt edges and pages that crackled with newness, and Alara sat in a window seat overlooking the mountain valley and read until her eyes ached and her heart felt dangerously close to hope. On the 5th night, she found him in the armory, sharpening a blade by lamplight. The sound of steel on stone filled the room. rhythmic and hypnotic. His shirt was off. She could see the 3 scars on his flank, raised and pale, healing but not gone. She sat on the bench across from him. He did not look up. The lamplight caught the gold in his eyes and turned them to fire. "Why me?" she asked. He stopped sharpening. The silence was full of steel dust and lamp oil, and the particular tension of 2 people who were circling something enormous. "Because you sang," he said, "because every wolf in every territory would have run from a bleeding lichen in a ravine. And you knelt in the water and put your hands on my wounds and sang a lullaby as if I were a child who needed comfort instead of a king who needed saving. No one has treated me like a thing that needed comfort since I was 7 years old." Alara's throat tightened, and "because the bond does not lie," Kaelin said. He set the blade down. He looked at her directly, and his eyes were not a king's eyes. They were just eyes, tired and honest and afraid. "I have spent 15 years wondering if I would ever feel it. I had begun to believe I wouldn't. And then I heard you singing in the dark, and my wolf, the most dangerous wolf alive, the wolf that generals fear, lay down in the mud and put his head in your lap like a dog." He paused. "That is why you." Alara held his gaze. Her pendant pulsed. The bond between them shimmered like heat rising from summer pavement, visible if you knew how to look. She reached across the space between them and placed her hand on his scarred flank. He flinched. Not from pain. From the shock of being touched without agenda, without demand, without the transactional currency of power. His hand covered hers. His skin was warm. His heartbeat thudded against her palm, steady and real and alive because she had chosen to walk into a dark forest and kneel in a creek. They stayed like that. The lamp burned. The blade lay forgotten. Outside, wolves howled at a moon neither of them could see, and in the quiet space between 2 people learning to trust, something took root. But roots, even strong ones, can be torn up. Word traveled fast in the territories. The Lichen King had claimed a mate, a wolfless mate, a hollow girl from a mid-tier northern pack who wore an iron collar and mended books in a basement. The reaction was what Alara had expected. Horror, disgust, the kind of political outrage that disguises itself as concern for tradition. And then Alpha Daemon Cade came to Ironhold. He arrived with an entourage of 40 wolves and a formal petition to the crown challenging the mate claim. His argument was simple. Alara Voss was property of the Thornvale pack. Hollow wolves could not enter mate bonds. The collar was not merely a custom, but a legal designation, and by removing it, the Lichen King had violated territorial sovereignty. Alara learned this from Marin, who told her with the flat precision of a woman delivering a battle report. She also learned something else. Daemon had brought evidence. A healer's report from Thornvale, stamped and witnessed, declaring Alara Voss permanently wolfless, and a secondary document, a transfer of custody, signed when Alara was 5 years old, assigning her to Thornvale's hollow registry and relinquishing all claims of lineage. Her mother's signature was on the second document. Alara held the paper in her hands and stared at her mother's name, Sarah Voss, written in a hand she did not remember. The ink was faded. The paper smelled of the Thornvale archive, of mildew and old stone, and the particular sadness of things that have been buried too long, relinquishing all claims of lineage. "What lineage?" Alara asked. Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother was not from Thornvale. The registry lists her origin pack as Ardos. Artis, the royal bloodline, the king's bloodline." Alara felt the floor tilt beneath her. The confrontation happened in the great hall of Ironhold, before 300 wolves, because Daemon had demanded a public hearing, and Kaelin had granted it with the unhurried calm of a man setting a trap. Alara stood at the front of the hall. She wore no collar. She wore a simple gray dress that Marin had helped her choose, and her mother's pendant hung visible against her chest for the first time in her life. Her hands were steady. Her voice was not. Daemon made his case with the smooth confidence of an alpha accustomed to speaking without being challenged. He cited pack law. He cited precedent. He called Alara a hollow wolf, an asset, a ward of Thornvale, and each word landed on Alara's skin like the ghost of the collar she no longer wore. Kalen listened from the throne. His face was carved from granite. His gold eyes tracked Damon the way a wolf tracks a deer that has wandered too far from the herd. When Damon finished, Kalen spoke. "You brought documents," he said. "I brought a genealogist." A small woman stepped from the side of the hall. She was old, her back bent, her hands knotted with arthritis, and she carried a ledger so ancient its binding was held together with wire. "Sarah Voss," the genealogist said, and her voice was clear as a bell in the silent hall, "born Sarah Ardas, seventh daughter of the minor branch. Married out at 19. Declared dead at 24. She was not dead. She was hidden. And the child she hid was registered as wolfless at 5 years old, because a wolf that powerful, dormant in a body that young, reads as absence to any standard healer's test." The hall erupted. Damon's face went the color of ash. Alara pressed her hand to the pendant and felt it hum, not the gentle pulse she'd known all her life, but a deep, bone-shaking resonance that traveled through the floor and into the walls and made the torches in their sconces flicker and dance. Something moved inside her, deep beneath the scar tissue of 7 years of silence, beneath the collar's memory, beneath the cellar and the half portions and the years of being told she was hollow, empty, less than a wolf, not waking, not rising, unfolding. Slowly, deliberately, like a fist opening after being clenched so long the fingers have forgotten they could move. It filled her chest. It spilled into her limbs. It was not what she expected. Not rage, not power, not the savage thing the stories described. It was warmth. A steady, golden, immovable warmth, like sunlight on stone, like her mother's hands, like the hum of the pendant that had been singing to her wolf all her life, keeping it safe, keeping it dormant, keeping it waiting for the moment when Alara was strong enough to hold it. Her eyes changed. She felt it happen. The room gasped. Gold. Not Kalen's molten fire gold. Hers was softer, deeper. The gold of autumn fields, of honey, held up to light. Damon stepped back. His composure cracked. For one moment, one fraction of a breath, Ilar saw something in his face that was not fear or anger, but grief. A flash of the man who had almost looked at her in the rain 7 years ago. The man who had opened his mouth and then closed it. The man who had known, perhaps, that the collar was wrong and had chosen the easier path anyway, and was now standing in the wreckage of that choice. She had been under his care, she had been his responsibility, and he had let her rot. Alara looked at him. She did not gloat, she did not rage. She said, "You could have looked at me, Damon. That is all it would have taken. One look and everything might have been different." Damon said nothing. His wolves stood behind him, rigid, their eyes on the floor. Kalen rose from the throne. He descended the steps. He crossed the hall, and he stood before Damon Cade with the full weight of the Lycan crown behind him and said, in a voice that every wolf in the room would remember for the rest of their lives, she sang to a dying wolf in the dark when no one was watching. "That is more courage than your entire pack has shown in a generation. Touch her again. Address her again. Speak her name without her permission, and I will unmake Thornvale so thoroughly that cartographers will need new maps." He did not shout. He did not growl. He spoke the way mountains speak, with permanence. Then he turned to Alara. His gold eyes met her gold eyes, and the bond between them blazed so bright that wolves in the back of the hall had to look away. He cupped her face. His thumbs traced the grooves the collar had worn into her neck, the thin scars she would carry forever, and he kissed her. Not the way a king claims a prize. The way a man who nearly bled to death in a creek bed kisses the woman whose lullaby kept his heart beating through the longest night of his life. The hall did not cheer. It was too stunned. But 300 wolves knelt, one by one, like a field of wheat bending before a wind, and the sound of it was the sound of the world rearranging itself around a new truth. Damon Cade left Ironholt that evening. His petition was denied. His 40 wolves walked behind him in silence. At the gate, he paused and looked back at the fortress, not at the walls or the towers, at a window on the third floor where a lamp burned. Then he turned and walked into the dark, and Alara watched him go and felt the old ache. Not of anger, but of waste, of all the hollow wolves still wearing collars in Thornvale, of all the years that could not be unmended. She would mend what she could. She had always been good at that. The silver rue tree arrived 6 weeks later, a gift from a healer in the Southern Territories, who had heard the story of the wolfless queen and the wolf who waited. It came as a seedling in a clay pot no bigger than a soup bowl, its bark pale as bone, its single leaf catching the light like a mirror. Alara planted it in the Ironholt greenhouse, in a bed of dark soil that smelled of peat and rain. She pressed her pendant into the dirt beside the roots. She held it there and felt the hum travel from metal to earth to root to trunk, and the seedling straightened as if it recognized her. She visited it every morning. 6 months passed. The tree grew to 3 feet. Its bark stayed pale, its leaves shifting with the seasons, copper in autumn, silver in winter, a luminous green now that spring had come. Alara pressed her palm to the trunk each morning and felt the hum, the same hum her mother had told her to listen for, the heartbeat that outlasts the hand that holds it. The hollow collars were abolished in the 3rd month. Kalen signed a decree. Alara stood at his right hand. Across the territories, wolfless wolves were reclassified, evaluated, offered the care they had been denied. The change was not smooth. It was not universally welcomed. 3 Western packs resisted. Alara wrote the letters herself. She did not threaten. She did not moralize. She wrote about the archive, the dampness, the cot, the sound of water hitting a tin bucket in the dark. She wrote about what it meant to mend something that everyone else considered beyond repair. 2 packs complied within weeks. The 3rd held out, but their wolfless members began appearing at Ironholt's gates, thin and blinking and terrified and free. Alara met each one. She held their hands. She said, "You are not hollow. You never were." It was not enough. She knew that. Laws move faster than hearts, but it was a beginning, and Alara had learned that beginnings were her particular gift. She had begun her whole life in basements, in creeks, in dark places where nothing was supposed to grow, and she had grown anyway. Patient as a stone, quiet as a space between heartbeats. Damon sent no word from Thornvale. Reports said he governed adequately, kept his borders, opened the hollow registry to review. Whether that was fear of the crown or the beginning of something like conscience, Alaric did not know. She hoped for the latter. She did not need it. This morning, the greenhouse was warm with early light. Alara knelt beside the silver root tree and placed her palm against the bark. The hum traveled through her wrist, up her arm, into the space where her wolf lived, awake and golden and calm, curled around her heart like a cat in a sunbeam. A new branch was emerging from the upper fork of the trunk. Pale green, reaching toward the glass ceiling and the sky beyond it. You were up early. Kalen stood in the doorway in sleek clothes, his dark hair disordered, a cup of tea in each hand. He looked, in that moment, nothing like a king. He looked like a man who had woken in a warm bed and found the other side empty and come looking. "The tree is growing a new branch," Alara said. He crossed to her, set the cups on the potting bench, and crouched beside her. His shoulder touched hers. Through the bond she felt what he felt. A contentment so deep it was nearly geological. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something strong enough to hold it. She thought of the girl in the creek. The blood on her hands. The lullaby she'd sung to a wolf she did not know, in a forest she was not supposed to enter, on a night she was not supposed to survive. That girl was not gone. She lived inside Alara the way the wolf did, the way the pendant's hum did, the way her mother's voice did. A chapter, not the whole story. She kissed Kalen's jaw, the sharp angle where bone met the warm skin behind his ear, and stood. "Come on," she said. "There is work to do." She left the greenhouse with the king beside her. The tree hummed at her back. The morning light came through the glass and fell across the new branch like a hand reaching out, pale and green and trembling with the effort of becoming. The collar was gone. The wolf was awake. The story was not over, but the next branch was already growing. Thank you for listening. If this story made your chest tighten, if you felt the hum of that pendant in your own bones, if sailing kneeling in the creek mud made your breath stop, then you felt exactly what Alara felt when the world finally made room for her. That feeling is why we tell these stories, and we have so many more waiting for you. Hit that like button if his words, "She sang to a dying wolf in the dark when no one was watching," gave you chills. Share this with someone who needs to hear that silence is not the same as emptiness, that the thing the world calls broken might just be waiting. Subscribe, tap that bell, and join us for the next tale of fated mates, hidden bloodlines, and wolves who refuse to stay hollow. Drop a comment and tell us which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the lullaby in the creek? The collar snapping? The moment her eyes turned gold? We want to know. Your pack is here. Welcome home.